Okay, here we are. Welcome to the listening, Igor Jocic. How are
Thank
you,
you.
sir? How does this day find you?
Yeah, pretty a bit stressed, and a sort of looking for sort of gaps where to kind of grab a bit of peace and rest, sort of almost kind of like dodging tasks and things. Just when you get kind of a little bit tired, you're sort of naturally sort of looking for these gaps in work, and sort of trying to extend them. Some people call it procrastination, but I don't know if that's exactly what it is when it kind of happens in the middle of doing something.
But maybe an essential part of the work, though, right? Those sort of pauses. I always used to think that when I used to smoke years ago, especially when I was working physically, like making something, or smoking was this great chance to just stop and kind of consider, step back, have a look at what you're doing, and just it was that sort of a bit, I suppose, like a tea break or something. But it somehow, more than a tea break, the cigarette seemed to like really fit with the process, especially of making, of building, because it just gave you that, almost like you needed that excuse not to be physically doing anything, so you could actually think about or just see what you were doing, step back and have a look at it. So maybe you're looking for an equivalent. You're mostly computer based, right? So
I mean, I totally see it. Like it's almost kind of ritualistic, but there is kind of like a factor that I'm sure is aiding that sort of mechanism, and it must be in the way that in the type of drug nicotine is, that kind of like both relaxes you and focuses you at the same time, and I remember my parents smoking, but I never quite saw the rhythm in that, Then I've heard of
that's because
people.
they were chain smoking, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was quite it was a solid sort of backbeat. No, yeah, I guess. But what I sort of realized or kind of observed, especially since the kind of smoking started to be, forbidden in sort of public places, spaces and so on, then you would get these people kind of smoking wherever they could, and the allocation of these, dedicated spaces was poor, right? So people would just kind of hang, especially in winter, they hang out around these building entrances and so on. And you would see this kind of thing happen where somebody would step out and you'd sort of catch a glimpse of them from like the upper deck of the bus or something like that. And they would stand there in a very particular kind of, in a certain sort of manner. And as soon as they light the cigarettes, take a first drag, they would kind of completely change their posture, and they were very unconscious of it.
Yeah.
And it says it all, really,
Yeah, that's such a strong image of that from London, from the city, people huddling, because it was just when I guess just before I left London, was when all that legislation came in where you couldn't smoke in certain places.
Yeah.
And these little clusters of people outside big glass, office building, sort of hunched over in their shirt sleeves in the middle of winter, like shivering, but, and this kind of camaraderie of the group of smokers, And there was something, I remember writing a poem about it, actually. There was something quite beautiful about them, but also it's so desperate and so kind of, so human as well, in the face of this enormous kind of straight, clean building and this grimy little scene of
Yeah.
human addiction and
Sort of
just wanting a break, a bit of fresh air. Relatively fresh air for them.
It's a sort of like a betraying the sort of the perfection of this, of the scene, like almost like a almost like a nick in a sort of like a sleeve of a perfectly tailored suit or something, like the sort of fraying of a cashmere jumper.
Yeah, yeah, such a powerful image, that one. It always used to capture me, as I in that way on the bus, or you just get a glimpse of
Yeah,
the huddle, especially in the winter. It seemed more stark and dramatic somehow,
yeah,
because it often, really hunched up because it was freezing, and they're not, they're coming from a very air conditioned sort of warm office
yeah,
where
yeah,
everyone's in short sleeves or shirts, or yeah, amazing.
yeah.
Yeah,
And then
I sort of forgot about the addiction side of the cigarette break. There was also the body's need for a top up as well.
yeah.
But
Well, no, there's definitely something about that. I mean, like, I mean, I don't. They say there's like three. There's only three kinds of smokers. Ones that will never stop, ones that can stop anytime, the social type, and then the ones that try and never do it again. And it's a pretty stable kind of constant sort of um, result of these studies. A lot of the addiction actually is in that kind of
yeah, addiction.
similarly kind of broken down of other addiction. But they say that vaping, although not physically as harmful, not even close, because of the absence of tar and so on, it's actually a lot more addictive. You know, people also think because there's a conviction that it's not so harmful, right? So people do it even more or less. You know, they don't really inhibit any kind of drive towards there's no barrier, right? They're just really now doing it. It's really really interesting.
Maybe you can. I've never done it, so I don't know. But maybe you can actually inhale more because perhaps there was a limit that your body even
Oh,
was.
yeah,
"Okay,
possibly.
that's a bit overwhelming." Even a heavy smoker perhaps had a sort of feeling of, okay, I can't quite take any more of that. But if it doesn't have that sort of toxic side,
Yeah,
in a kind of in the blunt way of tar or the smoke, then maybe you can just have a lot more of it.
possibly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's so much addiction. I mean, it's everywhere, right? It's almost kind of standard now for
yeah.
culture. Seems to be. I mean, I wonder if there are any people who don't have an addiction of some sort. Maybe there are some, but I really think they must be a minority because I see it all over the place.
Yeah,
And even in
yeah,
my own life, where I've pretty much cut out most things, it's still there. It's still the blueprint is still there, looking for something to kind of latch onto. Yeah,
yeah. I wonder if it's a sort of the whole sort of tendency to attach, and because we call all kinds of attachments addictions now, so it used to be just a kind of physical dependency, but now any kind of habit that's sort of um, really unconscious, seems to be thought of as an addiction, right? And then there's all these kind of other addictions that are called addictions, but people are still kind of suspicious of them, like workaholism and sex addiction and whatever, that sort of stuff.
I think
Yeah,
they
I
all
don't
have
really know.
that. They all share that, probably that common origin, which is an attachment thing. With your mother, probably. I think most of that. It seems to me that maybe most of the wounding that underwrites addiction comes from your relationship with your mother, and particularly because in the West we have such a bizarre way of beginning life, and it's sort of in general, although it's been changing a little bit in recent years, but it's generally quite medicalized, and there, that sort of that kind of animal attachment that happens when you don't have a whole medical system around you, when you're just born and then you're
Yeah,
your mother, and you stay on your mother, and it's skin to skin, and for the first few years of life you're kind of completely plugged in. And it seems to me, from watching my own kids grow, and our kind of experiments in that realm of trying to be more attachment based, and understanding my own culture and my own background, it seems to me that that really is the most important thing in the beginning of life, and any kind of absence or interruption or separation probably causes these kind of the kind of damage which leads to addictions later in life. And I think because that's most people's experience of being born and coming into the world in the West is a kind of detached version of that. That's why we have such incredibly high addiction rates. That's my theory anyway.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes kind of wonder if that kind of more natural, if you like, or more pre-civilized kind of way of rearing of infants, especially, you know, and children, we're just going to prolong what now would be seen as hugely prolonged sort of period of, you know, physical contact, even breastfeeding and so on. Whether that is actually sort of part of a very different communal living in general, you know, because I feel that even with that kind of start in our society, you at one point you'll get exposed, right? And the hope is they will give you a better start, but who's to say that for a different personality trait that it wouldn't actually create a higher hazard in being, you know, less likely to, you know, take off or, you know, step out or, but then, you know, people live in all kinds of ways. The interesting thing for me was, you know, probably the most interesting thing that I've ever read about, or the most kind of, how would I say, the greatest impression from anything I read about addiction was a few years back. It was Russel Brand kind of being kind of introduced in a written form in an article. And I don't remember reading a similar article, but somebody was actually, like an editor has almost written like an introduction in an article opening the topic of addiction, right? Almost kind of like introducing Russel Brand. And then him sort of writing immediately after that. And the first thing he wrote is, having been already sober or off heroin for 6-7 years or whatever at a time, the first thing he wrote, he said, like, the last time I thought about using heroin was 2 days ago or something like that. You know, it was like, and, you know, it was that kind of like, suddenly that really brought it home to me, you know, like, you know, and then he described what happened, you know, and it was basically, he could feel his relationship heading for a breakup, and his body's memory of this relief from that pain, no matter how common and how bearable the pain might have been, you know, at somebody of his maturity, he was already in his kind of late 30s or whatever, that his immediate thought was, you know, he wanted to actually smoke some heroin, it was just like, and that really, you know, it really kind of changed my understanding of what it really is, right? You know, because he linked it to pain, and not physical pain, emotional pain, and that kind of, and it was such a kind of like it wasn't a banal pain, because pain never is, but it was just one of those things that many people go through, right? And I don't even think it was such a significant relationship for him, you know, but the fact that it kind of like triggered that sort of feeling. And, you know, I also remember my father telling me, like 20 years after he stopped smoking, he would still get a craving, you know, like, you know, it's just the funniest sort of thing. But it's yeah.
Yeah.
Who
Well,
knows?
I mean, you touched on something there as well, which I think is important. The context, you know, we're talking about attachment with the mother, but you're absolutely right. This kind of communal context, you know, not just that you're having that total attachment and you're completely with your mother in the beginning when you're at your most vulnerable, but she is held within a community that supports her, that she's not isolated in a nuclear family situation in a little box somewhere where maybe she's got a partner who's gone out to work or whatever it is. There's this kind of sense of support, so in those moments when you do just need to do something, you can just hand the baby to some trusted other, and there's those kind of interactions, but it's all within this context, within this field of security and familiarity and this sense of safety, or being, that, and in a way maybe that where your first experiences of leaving the mother and facing the world are really kind of gentle and nourishing and supportive. It's not this kind of being torn away and then you're in this stark, horror sort of reality where there's nobody there for you. So, all of those early experiences obviously have a massive impact on shaping who we are. And I think that really that's probably at the base of most of our, emotional substance issues in the West, is all about the beginning of life and the way our most basic units like the family and community are organized or not, or the lack of a real sense of belonging, or it's so, it makes total sense to me. And I think part of when we had kids, part of our drive was to try and somehow recover some of that space and support in the very beginning. And also I would weave in the land as well, like the kind of physical environment and the landscape being a part of that, almost like the next layer after community is the place where you live and the supportive nature of that, and also the kind of threats and dangers, but also just belonging, this sense of belonging to a place, as well as, we really didn't have the community thing because it doesn't exist in that way in Britain, but we had some kind of community, but we definitely had the land and that kind of community of living things and, geology and geography. And that was, to me, that was a really fundamental part of it too, which I hadn't realized until I kind of saw them growing up in it, and how supportive and in some ways how it enabled them to learn in a way that I still don't quite understand, but I know it had an impact, a positive, a really
absolutely
impact. Like it just playing in the dirt, playing and being around and having those kind of incredible moments of pure being and witnessing nature as it is. It's so profound and it's so influential and beneficial. And it will be interesting to see now that they're more engaged with the system and they're in schools and, which we held off for a long time. But now they're in that, I'm kind of curious as they become adults, whether or not I'll be able to see the impact of those early days or kind of, because it already looks like, it's had a profound impact on them, but it's kind of hard to tell. I'd have to see them in years to come and in a different context.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I kind of feel that there are certain constants to human psychology, and they're just manifested slightly, differently, or just differently, depending on, your sort of background, but essentially they're very similar, and when you have somebody sort of growing up in today's world, quite a special kind of circumstance, like your kids have, it's very easy to kind of see it from our kind of perspective of difference, right? Whereas to them, it's the only thing, right? So the difference is only kind of experienced later down the line. and like you said, one hopes that that's going to just kind of enable them to live better in some way, and there seem to be already. I mean, from what I hear about Grace, she seems to have really kind of found her way in and around the school, the whole kind of scene. She seems to really like it. Obviously, she's quite a sort of knowledge and learning kind of driven person, right? But that seems to be really working for her.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many factors, obviously, but yeah, I mean, I wonder just what the impact of that will be. I guess it's so subliminal, and
Yeah.
you can never separate that from who they are. But I definitely had a sense very early on that wherever they are in the world, whatever they're doing, they'll always be able to connect in with the nature of the landscape wherever they are in a very effortless way, almost like indigenize instantaneously. I really get that sense that that's a kind of skill, or not even a skill, maybe just a way of being, like an altered state almost, that they could just access that, or maybe even unconsciously, and feel connected in some way. A bit of this is my kind of imagination, but
But what's really interesting to me, like when I look at two of them, I see Lila as somebody who is closer to what my impression is of a kind of nature type person, right? And the whole kind of thing really fits with her in a very expressed kind of way. Whereas, Grace, who is more kind of bookish and sort of like, she still has it, it's very much part of her, but it's almost like that, kind of like what you said, it's that kind of like an extra skill, that's kind of like an extra sort of aspect of her. I wouldn't even say personality, but kind of sort of acquired personality almost, like that sort of, so it's kind of like almost like a second nature where for Grace, it's more like the nature, the very nature, like that's what I'm sort of getting. And it's kind of interesting.
Well, you mean Lila? She's more, yeah.
Oh, yes, Lila. So yeah,
more physical. So
yeah.
But I know what you mean. Yeah.
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 Oh, that's interesting.
It is. It's sort of. It's become a bit of a thing because it's been my journey as well since I've been living here now, or 17 years or whatever it is, and I've been on, without realizing it, been on a kind of a course on reconnecting with the land and realizing how maybe fundamentally important some kind of reconnection is for any kind of culture moving forward, or at least some kind of integration with this very digital technical realm that we're also occupying. But a real sense I have of having to have our feet very much connected to the physical ground, and a relationship, a healthy relationship with the places where we live.
How did you,
If there's any chance for us to move forward, because it's either completely leave the physical realm and upload ourselves into machines, or we have to reconcile that kind of damaged relationship and reconnect, because we are still so woven into the web of life, and our neglect of that and outright kind of damaging and destruction and toxification of that living landscape has pushed us to the brink now, and we're very close to making it uninhabitable, it seems. So I really feel it. It's so strong in me now, this kind of knowledge of we've got to start relating, because what I learned from living here and being so involved with the landscape is when you fall in love with a place, which is inevitable if you're that close to it, you could never actually harm it, and because it's such a source of support and love and healing and meaning, and you're so much more connected with the cycles of life and the seasons and the weather and all those things which bring real deep meaning to life. And I can see how they are the origins of culture as well, that culture comes out of landscape. That's why different places on earth have different cultural traditions, different mythologies, because the landscape is the first kind of generator of those things. It's the primal kind of motivator, I suppose. And it's interesting because perhaps as we move into this digital world now, there'll be new cultures. Well, there are already, I suppose, that are primarily kind of motivated by that environment, which is non-physical.
Yeah.
So the kind of integration of those two, to me, is the ideal now. Is that we, and it's not a going backwards thing because that's impossible. It's just remembering. It's like a renaissance. It's remembering, remembering that and bringing all our kind of current sort of levels of awareness and kind of achievement in terms of development,
Yeah.
consciousness development, bringing all of that and these new technologies and all of that advancing we've done, bringing that back in and regrounding it and seeing what cultures can kind of emerge from that. And that to me is super exciting if we manage to somehow avoid the catastrophic trajectory we're on. And and a lot, and it's happening all over, that these new shoots of culture are growing through and they are coming from the land. If those can kind of take root and get some strength before the old ways finally go into chaotic collapse, then that's going to be where it's at. And it feels like such a,
I think it's
so powerful. It's so powerful.
Yeah, I think it's it's almost like a kind of personal value shift. People sort of through not being particularly either generous or out of character, or even socially aware. There's a particular kind of consciousness of self-interest, that seems to be arising, whether it's from sort of realizing that you have limited time, that we are kind of built for joy, and as soon as you turn around, as soon as you kind of have a half of that realization and turn around, what are you going to choose? A sort of concrete jungle, or some kind of, even if it's a kind of pretend, nostalgic sort of, simulation of natural, or, so that kind of nostalgic drive is very strong, and it's not. I don't find it's necessarily. It doesn't have that kind of like a industrial. It's not that kind of like a industrial nostalgia or modernist nostalgia or anything like that. It's very much rustic, in its kind of aesthetic, and I think that's kind of what some people are gravitating towards, I think that's really, I think that's encouraging, because if you expect too much from people, from the kind of moral kind of stance or ethically, you're bound to be disappointed, because no one can really sustain that for that long. But if people find their own kind of interest in it, and kind of like benefit, it's then it becomes more hopeful, I guess.
The way into it is through the body, of course, and that there's also a revival of interest in the physical, which is no accident, because we've been so in our heads, we've so extremely gone out of balance in a way as a culture. The sort of reaction to that has been this kind of resurgence of interest in physical fitness and all these disciplines like yoga and people going to the gym, but all of that stuff, because it's physical and it puts you in touch with your sensations, inevitably puts you in touch with, or starts a kind of process of noticing and maybe even yearning for that connection with the greater body, which is the living earth. And it's so sensual, that's the thing you're describing. It's such a sensual experience, which is the contrast between, let's say, a park in the city and an office building. It's such a sensual experience. It's so physically pleasurable when it's done in the right way, And even when it's challenging physically, or in terms of sensations like cold weather or ice, or the shock, or too much heat, it also, they're kind of layers and layers of exploration there. And you can really, for me at least, the more I'm exploring into my feeling and body, the more pleasurable it becomes. And even those extremes, I start to find ways to enjoy extremes of temperature that I didn't used to like. And now I'm doing my kind of cold showers every morning, which is so exhilarating. And it's become a kind of a joyous activity now. So if it isn't frozen, because I've got it set up here, I've got a shower set up outside under some huge pine trees, so enormous columns going straight up, and then there's a wall of logs, a bit like this behind me, but just stacked up logs
Yeah.
without anything in between, that creates the kind of extended room. It's like a little room. And then the shower head is just coming from a hose pipe with a hose fitting on it, that's up in a hazel tree that overhangs. So, every morning, just, and it's even been in the dark in the winter, getting up, it might be freezing cold, and the wind, we might be getting an easterly wind where it's fucking freezing. But the whole experience is so exhilarating. And there's a little ritual of, I go out there with my towel on and my sandals, and I'll take my sandals off and I'll just step on the ground. And even that, the kind of grounding, the sort of electrical grounding to begin with. And then I get in and do my kind of one arm, then the other, one leg, then the whole ritual. And it's so pleasurable now, because I notice every day now, there's this moment of mental doubt just before I get in, and it's the mind going, "What the fuck are you doing?" But the body's like, as soon as I'm doing it, the body just knows what's going on, and I have this overwhelming kind of, it's like a rush of good feeling, and there's that weird kind of warmth that comes almost straight away. As soon as I start getting cold, my body generates the heat to kind of counter that. And by the time, the last thing I do is sort of turn around, which is the most intense bit, is on the back for some reason. It's not anywhere else, it's when I do that moment of turning around, it's on my back, shoulders, and going down my back.
That's that kind of like your back of your neck, down.
That's when the full sort of cocaine rush comes in, and then I'm just like, whoa, let's go. Ready.
I'm almost wondering, because of the, like you said, there's this kind of mental resistance, right? Whether, the sort of, the transformational sense, that you must get from that, on sort of daily basis, like where you almost kind of have this kind of little victory over yourself in a way, I'm kind of wondering whether that's there's something in that, because that's probably the most invigorating feeling, when you've somehow managed to transcend, with intensity.
You're breaking through a fear.
That's right, yeah.
It's like a fear. You're breaking through a fear, and there's always, we all know that feeling when there's something that's been bothering you or you're really afraid of, and then you conquer it in some way. You actually do it, and it turns out fine. And then the exhilaration of like, well, it was nothing, and now I feel great. So there must be, you're right. I mean, there is a very physical set of responses going on, but I guess it's married with that kind of mental breakthrough of that. then and I suppose all the kind of story of what it's doing, because I definitely have this story that this is really good for me, and that, and it's backed up now. And we all know about the placebo effect, but our minds have such a profound influence on everything,
Yeah.
obviously. But I mean, there are definite effects. Like I have, because I do it in combination with a breathing. I do a breathing exercise first, as soon as I wake up, and then I have the shower. So, but the two together, I've not, for the first time in my whole adult life, the last 2 years I've been doing it, I've not been ill. I've not had any kind of flu, or even when I get the beginnings of a cold, it doesn't last now. It just kind of tries to get in and then goes. And it's not that I haven't been having all kinds of stresses and all the other things that would normally make me ill or susceptible to a virus, and I'm convinced it's that. I'm absolutely convinced that that has done that for me.
Yeah, it may well be.
Yeah.
Maybe not,
I think the only other thing I'd want to bring into it would be a sauna, like the other extreme, because I've been thinking about building a sauna so I can do that,
Yeah.
especially in the winter, because out here in the countryside, especially just before Christmas, November, December, and sort of now the beginning of January, it's so damp, the cold, and that really gets into you. And it's a hard thing that you need to overcome, especially if you're not living in a very hot, centrally heated house or whatever. But having that super dry heat of a sauna, a dry sauna, obviously, I just feel like that would completely drive out anything that any of that cold that's sort of soaking in, and would be an incredibly invigorating thing as well. So
Yeah.
I think that maybe
I
that's the
have
final piece. I need to build the sauna, and then
No, it's very special, that feeling of that dry heat.
Yeah.
In fact, I have a little bit of a, I don't know what to call it, fascination. When I lived in South Carolina, it would get very hot there, and you'd be in these frigid kind of air-conditioned spaces, wherever you'd go, they're really kind of, it's almost like a kind of like a status demonstration, where you can chill them. So you're virtually refrigerated wherever you go. And then because you need a car, you use the car for everything. You get out, and then you get in the car, that hot car, and the doors just shut on you. And that, just that feeling of that, like that's so like really hot, like completely transforms, like that makes you really aware of your body, even though it's completely, the whole story is very artificial, compared to your experience, but it really has that kind of, very much like the sauna, kind of that sort of feeling of like you kind of don't want to be there, but you can't quite leave. Then you have to leave because obviously they want to chase you out, because there's rules about sauna, how much you can use it and so on, exactly how that feels. But this whole idea of that kind of wet cold, that kind of moist, so damp cold, it's so characteristic of this country, because you have Scandinavians, who live with the cold. You've got all the kind of Eastern Europeans, especially Russians, who live with much more extreme cold, but their lives are organized around being warm, in a kind of modern way. So they come to England and they freeze, and then they look at the English people, in British people who walk around in sort of scantily clad, right, in this weather, I mean, John and Chad, we always used to talk about, we would say things about them like they're made of something different from all of us, and it's that kind of topic, especially like in West London, where there's a kind of very cosmopolitan. So when people don't speak about private schools and property, they talk about how cold it is in England without being cold, without being thermometer cold,
Yeah.
but
It is.
being that kind of like a frozen inside cold.
Yeah, it soaks into your bones. It's a totally different feeling. You can stand much colder temperatures if it's dry. There's just something about that damp. And if the wind's blowing as well, damp, cold with the wind blowing, it's
Yeah,
mortal. Yeah.
yeah. But it's really funny how when living in America and people would go like they'd go like, yeah, England's such a great place, so charming and so kind of quirky and blah blah blah. But why are their houses so cold? Can't they warm them up? You're thinking like, well, that gives them a chance to wear their cashmeres and tweeds. I mean, what else would they have them for? Another thing you love them for, has an actual purpose. Keeps you sort of warm, right? And it's just a funny thing. I think there's almost a sensation, there's almost a form of comfort, like, in that sort of make yourself cozy despite the draft and damp and and the whole kind of drinking of tea and
It's
everything,
contrast, isn't it? It's the contrast.
Cravats, that kind of stuff, being sort of warm around your neck, if nowhere else.
Well, and there's such pleasure in those things as well, because since I've lived here, in the winter I wear thermals. I wear like long johns, like sort of leggings and kind of top. And I discovered a few years ago this company that made a mix of wool and silk. So they're super thin and light, but they're so warm. And there's just something about your middle, your sort of waist and kidneys, and if that's warm, I'm so warm, and your legs have got that double layer of whatever trousers you're wearing, and it is really sensual. It's like such a pleasurable feeling of, doesn't matter what the environment's doing, I'm in this kind of nice, even warmth all day, and if anything, it becomes an issue if you're outside working or doing something physical and then you get too hot. So I'll often, because I cut firewood in the winter, and I'll be wearing a shirt, in the middle of winter, and because I'm hot, I'll be like rolling up my sleeves, and it's that wonderful contrast again. So it might be a really icy day, but I'm so warm inside, that I found that kind of balance. Yeah, it's all about pleasure, I think, even though it may not seem like pleasure, to have a cold environment, but like you say, in mainland sort of Europe and Russia, or anywhere like that, North America, Canada, people are dressed for it. So once they've got the right kit on, they're fine, or their houses, I guess, are kind of heated in a certain way.
Well, because it's so immediately life-threatening,
Yeah.
It's not something that you could even try and build resistance against. I mean, even the sort of indigenous, ancient people were kind of protecting themselves from that in the right way, right? So,
well, they'd have to survive, right?
It's just here because it's not so, it's kind of cold, but and until it really kind of gets into you, you almost don't notice it, and then once it does, you almost can't warm up, like it's just that kind of thing. It's a kind of sneaky sort of thing, it's not really easy to, and that persistent moisture, that kind of wetness, I think, that's a sort of heat exchanger, against wind especially. I mean, it can get really uncomfortable, when you have that kind of like an ultra, like -20, but it's still and really dry. It's a very different experience, it's not, it's just interesting. Yeah.
The weather has become a thing for me in recent years. A kind of source of pleasure. It's like reading the news every day, just sort of seeing what the weather's doing, wind direction, and all the characteristics of different directions of the wind, and they all have personalities. It's fascinating once you're in it in that way. And these are the layers, I suppose, of understanding a place. That's one of the aspects where you get to learn how certain weather situations, what they do and what they bring.
I was wondering, when did you sort of first get that sort of spark? Because obviously you were a sort of city kid, right? You were born.
Yeah, but I think it was in me from the beginning, because even growing up in Manchester, I was always looking for the green spaces, and even little bits of, like, there'd be little bits of sort of wasteland behind buildings that would have trees in, or tiny little pockets of land that maybe it would never been developed, which still had a bit of tiny sort of weird bits of woodland that were often full of rubbish, but they were so kind of attractive to me as a kid. And at one point during my childhood, my parents moved sort of further out, progressively further out of the centre of Manchester, more and more suburban, I guess, as we were growing up. And at one point they were living somewhere which was kind of quite built up, but not far away, like a 10-minute walk. There was this golf course, which is all,
Right.
completely manufactured, but within it, you've got the sort of edges of it. You've got woodland and little areas of rough and streams going through it. And I spent hours and hours and hours like a wild animal in those places where the people on the golf course playing golf didn't know I was there. I was like a wild animal. And I knew inside out, I knew every inch of that place, and I used to find all their lost golf balls. I remember having like a collection of 200 golf balls or something.
You should have sold it back to them. That's for kids in America.
Yeah. It would become a thing, and I sort of knew where they would all end up, and there were all these like ways of knowing a place.
Wow.
Some profound experiences, almost kind of spiritual experiences. I can remember just like laying in this long grass where it's sort of, you'll lay back and it's above you and it's long. And it was maybe September, because I can see that sort of golden light you get in September.
Yeah.
And the wind's blowing, but I'm sheltered enough and the sun's shining on me, and I'm just kind of basking in the heat of the sun, and I'm feeling so completely relaxed and at one with everything. So many moments like that growing up as a kid, and climbing trees, and and my parents were kind of, wherever we were, if we had a garden, they were quite sort of keen gardeners as well. So there was always like this relationship with the soil and things being grown. So there was that to add to it as well.
Scratching around.
Yeah. And then I have this very vivid memory of the first time. I was probably, maybe I was about 7 or something like that. And we went on a holiday in the summer up to Cumbria, because my gran used to rent a little cottage up there. And it was the first time I'd been up there, or that I remembered. And we drove up, we drove up from Manchester, and then we got there to where we were staying, and there was a sort of a hill fell nearby that we sort of went down to the river at the bottom of the fell. And then I just ran up it, and I was because it was open space, and it was like bracken and rocks and, fast flowing streams and rivers. And I was so ecstatic. I just ran up this fell up to the top, and then came back down and spent hours just playing in the river, like moving boulders around. And there's something so rich about a river like that, in the mountains or the hills, where you've got that fast flowing water. It's so beautiful and interesting. And I would be always damming them and just messing around. And all of those experiences, I was so deeply connected, and that they stood out. So those were I was either having that experience or I was in my imagination.
Yeah.
All the other kind of aspects of life were just quite boring, you know.
It's funny because it doesn't sound like it had a kind of taste of adventure. You know, it almost kind of like, it was almost kind of like the place for you. You know, it's almost like you belonged
Yeah,
there.
it was home.
It wasn't
Like,
extraordinary,
yeah,
even though it was.
wild. Yeah, it wasn't that kind of, oh, the call of the wild and this sort of. It felt like being at home. It was like, oh my God, this is me. I'm here. You know, it was really like that, like being in your native habitat. But maybe you know, true wilderness, which we don't really have in Britain. I mean, probably the only experience you can get a little taste of it in places in Scotland, and the sea actually is the closest I've going out on boats into the North Sea here. Just as soon as you get away from the land, it's fucking wild. The sea is always going to be wild. Doesn't matter, you know, you can't get off it, you can't stop it. It's total wilderness.
Yeah.
So, and that's quite terrifying. You know, I don't feel at home there. So I wonder if I went into real inhospitable wilderness, or far from kind of human habitation,
I mean,
whether I would still feel at home. I don't know.
I think there's a tendency to think of the wilderness and unknown as the same, whereas I feel that, you know, if you're in wilderness that's known to you, it must feel different, you know, because, you know, if you're in an unknown, even if it wasn't wilderness, it's often unsettling, you know. And I think it's unsettling because it occupies your mind in a way that kind of takes away the capacity and facility to actually focus on things that, you know, we were just talking about, you know, like this sort of peace and oneness and so on. Because even if you're not in a wild place that's not known to you, you know, you would feel threatened. So I think if you were in wilderness and off wilderness, I think it would be a different feeling. There'd be kind of more harmonious feeling. Whereas, you know, like you said, you know, you cannot really place into complete wilderness in this country, right? So you would always. It's almost impossible for you to think of wilderness as something that's sort of known to you, right? You would always have to travel for it and kind of like experience it as a sort of visitor, you know. And even if you decide to settle in wilderness, it will take you a long time before you really knew it, you know. So that's a little bit. It's almost. I feel it's almost impossible to judge it
Yeah, I mean,
without
so I'd be
anything
interested.
count.
I would be interested to know, actually, to try that, because I think a lot of what makes me feel comfortable are the kind of practical competencies I have in that situation. So, but then if I went somewhere like a jungle, which I've never been to jungle as a landscape, and you know, there's all these potentially deadly threats, like, you know, large predators and God knows
Yeah.
what, then I would probably have a very different experience. But I don't know. I mean, it would be a really interesting experience for me to find out how comfortable or at home I felt in that kind of environment.
Yeah.
Because I've not, you know, I haven't traveled massively to those kind of extreme um, environments. I haven't been to desert or jungle. So
Mm.
yeah, I don't know.
I think it's really sort of, if you have a way of orientating yourself confidently, so that you can actually create these. And I know people can be trained to do that, you know, to kind of really kind of concertedly focus on finding themselves in a place, right? Then they can create this mental space to function optimally or normally or even excel, right? You know, and I'm sure this all sort of sounds very much rings very much like some kind of specialist military training and stuff like that, you know. But you know, it's kind of like that, you know. I mean, but I actually I link it. I mean, like I said, you know, and again, you know, I seem to be kind of always going back to my sort of experience of moving to the States. But I remember kind of going there and wanting to move, and then finally moving, and then completely kind of losing sight, you know, because the reality hit. And what that kind of meant is everything was new, right? So there's this kind of like a period where I'm disorientated, right? And I'm sort of finding very little kind of very little kind of mental space to be who I know I am, someone who I recognize as myself, you know, being, you know, me, you know, the sort of like me experiencing myself, you know, and then just completely out of the blue, at one point, you know, it was a complete banal situation, like really funny. There was like I was at a petrol station, you know, fueling the car, and the neighboring car, there was this woman. She was in a kind of like a Chanel suit or something completely, you know, and she was the first person I actually saw. I saw her humanity after about 4 weeks, maybe even longer. And, you know, it was completely by accident. You know, it's like it wasn't somebody I at all related to, you know, or thought I would relate to. It just happened that, you know, there was a kind of mental switch where I was familiar enough with the surrounding that I finally started seeing people for being people, and not just this kind of mildly threatening kind of occupying sort of noise that, you know, and I know this doesn't compare to wilderness, but it's this disorientation, you know.
But it's a kind
and because I went into it completely without preparation, you know, I didn't expect that, stupidly. You know,
actually, cities or urban spaces are probably more challenging in that way. You know, or for me anyway. I think, you know, maybe there's a version of that where, you know, although I do have some kind of knowledge of cities, obviously, because the first half of my life was in cities, so there's some familiarity with those patterns, but still, you know, I think because in sensory terms, they're a lot more intense and toxic, you know, and this is something I notice even more now that I've lived in somewhere that's very, very clean, relatively. So they're kind of hostile in that way, and they're so overstimulating because there's so much going on that would be a lot more disorientating. It would take me probably longer to adjust, like you know, if I moved somewhere now and it was built up in that way, or there were lots of people around, that would probably be a lot more difficult for me to adapt to.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I'm sort of.
But we are adapters, you know. Humans are incredible, aren't they? As we know, throughout their history and the way they've spread throughout all these different environments, it's built in. We're built for that. We really are.
Strangely enough, though, you know, kind of almost going back to the start of the conversation, is with this intense digital life that we have now. At least I do, because I'm involved with so many things that I really unwisely sort of committed myself to. You know, it's a reprieve to get out, to get out on the street, you know, like in the middle of London. You know, it's kind of like, I feel like I can breathe. You know, it's like, you know, there's the tunnel vision, and especially the intensity. You know, like, you know, I mean, we're doing this now, and I'm doing this so much. You know, it's intense. You know, like, you know, speaking to people. You know, even screaming or not, right? You know, it's just. You know, so you kind of get out and, you know, winter air, you know, no matter how smoky and nasty, it's kind of like, whoa, it's like, you know, almost sort of getting some life into myself, you know. It's just incredible.
Movement, you know, moving your body, because if you're sitting all day, that you can't underestimate the importance of that movement in your body, that physical. Walking is such a great thing to do. Just.
Well, this is what the dog is really helping me now, you know, because without him, you know, another lucky thing is all the deliveries. because I'm on the third floor, so I have to run up and down.
Yeah, right.
Quite a lot actually, because they keep coming. That's another thing. It's just like, you never really thought of it, because post mail arrived once a day, right? When I was
Yeah. But now it's
even an adult,
and, yeah, every 5 minutes,
twice a day.
Yeah.
But you didn't rush to, it would fall through, right? Unless there was a package, which was, not that often in my life. No, it's just this thing, like, they keep sort of knocking, there's no bell here. Jeez.
Yeah, you spend your day running up and down stairs for packages.
Yeah, it's really quite something.
Yeah. Well, it keeps you fit, right?
Yeah, you're out of breath. Oh, yeah, don't worry. Well.
Yeah. So how is London now after a year of pretty much lockdown? Coming into a year, or it will be in March.
How was I know? No, it's
for you.
the interesting thing about being in the area I'm in is that the sort of ethnically kind of vibrant sort of street that's Uxbridge Road is, most of the shops on there are food related, so they're still open because they're essential. The restaurants, you can order in and then you can pick it up, so they all have open doors and these kind of like counters against the door. Sure. Where you sort of pick up. So the street is very buzzing still. Ravenscourt Park is busy, because that's really the only place where people now go. They're full of dogs, full of people, So, it's different, but from my point of view, it's not that different. But I understand that as soon as you go to areas which are more, sort of your sort of normal retail, that's where you kind of really see this deadness, this Omega Man kind of impression, because people are encouraged to stay home. So if you're walking around for exercise or walking a dog or whatever, it kind of hits you. But I'm not that aware of that because I'm actually still in an area that has some life in it. Obviously not with the schools closed. That obviously takes some of that kind of murmur, the children, like there's a couple of schools here,
right?
That's sort of disappeared now. I don't know, it's difficult to describe. It's very, very different, and it's different now. It's been different for such a long time that I'm slightly worried that my brain is starting to rewire. In a way that I don't want to think about, because basically I'm remembering things as recently as last year as almost like remembering a movie. Yeah. Right. There's that kind of level of alienation from that life, at least for me. And that's partly the intensity, because I didn't really afford myself any idle time, which a lot of people actually had quite a lot of. And this is not a judgment, I actually feel I should have, but I didn't. And it's that intensity that inevitably, because it's this kind of very different tunnel vision mode, it's sort of changing the way my sort of brain works. I'm adapting. I kind of don't like it because it's not something that I particularly want to adapt to, or get used to, but like as we said, because we're looking for pleasure, right? For comfort, right?
Yeah, I think it seems to me like, it's funny because I felt this almost straight away as soon as we went into this whole lockdown thing the first time, and the kind of hysteria that I was seeing around it. I realized that the world was changed forever at that point, even that early on. And I think what you're talking about, I can see how, because we adapt and we get used to stuff, you know, my fear, I suppose, is that we get used to all this kind of control and restriction, and it becomes so normalized that, you know, and given the history of governments or kind of authorities not giving back the power they take in times of crisis, you know, if you think of the States and 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and, you know, even in Britain, but now all that's going on around this and all the control, and then if you couple that sort of tendency of powers not to give up that control or that extra power they've got, with a population who's got used to a certain way of being, you know, that to me is a terrifying recipe, or a kind of, it's kind of not even terrifying. Well, there are aspects of it which are terrifying, but it's pretty depressing, you know, that sort of,
Yeah.
you know, we do get used to shit as well, you know, and you think about the kind of horrendous regimes that still exist on Earth and how people get used to it and they just adapt. And then once you're in it, you kind of become institutionalized, and you know, there's obviously a point where it becomes harder not to do it than it does to do it. And then the chances of kind of coming out of it then become more and more difficult. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, really, I was quite surprised today because I found, just by chance, I found this video on YouTube, which was, it was these three doctors, I think one from Britain, one from America, one from somewhere else, maybe in Europe, who basically got together, or they not doctor, or they were doctors, but they were kind of experts in the field of kind of viruses or kind of contagious disease or whatever it is, who'd kind of signed this thing and got all these other kind of professionals to sort of sign this whole document about how, you know, they basically had this whole plan to offer the governments of the world on how better to do the response to the virus, and how, you know, basically from what I can gather, they were saying that we need to isolate the vulnerable and the elderly and basically let everybody else get on with life and develop that natural immunity which we've always done, you know, as a species. And the fact I hadn't even heard about it, you know, and this was 3 months ago that this thing was made. And I realized then that the conversation, and, you know, and it's something I'd noticed, the lack of intelligent conversation discussing the wider picture of what's going on was completely absent. And it was like this emergency kind of mode where we just, somebody in charge makes decisions and don't ask questions. And now we've kind of, because we've had almost a year of this, all those initial stories, no matter how flawed or inaccurate they were, have now become fact just by having existed for so long. And now we're building stories on top of those stories. There's no going back. There's no going back to that original point of, well, hang on a minute, is this really what we think it is? And it was kind of a sinking feeling when I saw this thing and I realized none of the media or anyone had picked up on this or put it, you know, you'd expect it to be like headline news if the media still worked, which of course I've known for a long time now that that's totally broken. But it really brought it home to me that the intelligent conversation and decision making is completely absent. You've got government who are only interested in politics and staying in power, and are so corrupted by corporate interests now, and the media who's also corrupted by corporate interests, it seems. So there's no sense making going on from those authorities, and now we've got this increased regulation and control, and what you're saying, this kind of adaptive nature of humans to get used to whatever they're in. So all of that together, fuck, you know.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's it's really hard to get one's head around. I think that's probably why it keeps happening, because it's not easy to.
Well, it's complex, right?
It's almost kind of like. It's almost kind of like. It feels almost like we couldn't quite do it if it wasn't for those kind of post-war years where certain kind of smart things were done for the time anyway. But then almost immediately kind of started eroding,
Like what? For example, what?
Well, like the sort of like the New Deal, in America, and like no matter how half-heartedly or half sort of way implemented, but sort of Bretton Woods, and the sort of and all of those all of those kind of like agreed curbs on merchant banking and and so on. All of those things were kind of smartly kind of thought of conceptually, right, and then sort of implemented in some kind of seemingly controlled way, and it seemed to have kind of created a certain level of at least like a couple of decades of some kind of if you like, so lifting emancipation of some of the kind of impoverished or whatever, some kind of the rebuilding happened, all that kind of stuff. Of course, it was industrial, so now we reflect on it, quite negatively, but I think it wasn't really allowed to evolve, once the industrial kind of systems established themselves to such an intensity, I feel that they were then sort of very quickly co-opted by the financial, system and so on. So it's very hard to kind of escape them, right? I kind of have this feeling that if the spirit of the post-war industrialization under the sort of this kind of like proper technocratic thinking, was really allowed to kind of then continue, I think that we would evolve a lot quicker with the awareness of environmental impact and so on. I have this feeling that this financialization has created a blindness because money became real rather than becoming this means, of sort of.
Well, it became the end,
right?
right?
Out of poverty, Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, and so then it's almost like a suppression of progress happened. So on the one hand, certain things seem to have progressed incredibly, but I feel they wouldn't have if they weren't financially, viable, right?
Profit.
Whereas things that could have been
became the guiding principle. So that shaped everything. I mean, literally everything has been shaped by that, and to the point of destruction. But it really, that's interesting to hear it put in that way, because obviously it came in and took over the industrial, and then when the industrial kind of reached its end in the West anyway, then it jumped on the back of the informational kind of advance, the technological advance, and in a similar way, because this touches very much on kind of what you're working on as well, I think, where the original internet was this tremendously liberated space because profit hadn't found its way in there yet. It was, and the corporations hadn't got a handle on it. It was technologists, it was people, it was coders, it was creative minds who were generating this space, and the connectivity was really exciting. I mean, its tremendous potential was very quickly, we all took it for granted. There was a kind of golden age in the 90s where there was that blip where that whole old world hadn't caught up with what it was, and you could do anything, and you could do anything on a level with the biggest corporation in the world. You could have a website, that had the same potential reach, But I've really felt that change in, say, the last 5 or 10 years, where it's been shut down. And
Yeah.
even now, to the point where searching, like on Google, it's so compromised now that I can't even find things I know are there that I've put there myself, because they're not, they don't fit into their algorithm or whatever, or they're not financially incentivized in that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I wonder,
I mean, that's
there's a kind of struggle now for me, and this is something which I'm just brewing at the moment, is I feel like we're at a critical moment right now where if nothing is done now to kind of reclaim that original promise of the internet, then it's going to be lost forever. And because we're so close to that, the control now of the whole of that system, and it's been closing in and closing, and it's really being accelerated now, just, and maybe even more so since our kind of social and political lives are being more and more controlled, at least in the West. And I feel like we're at this critical moment, and there's this one sort of shining light is the Bitcoin story, but even that, now that the big money is really moving, after not realizing what it was, tremendously for Bitcoin, so it could quietly go on developing long enough to form enough infrastructure and to be disruptive enough that eventually, after all the kind of demonizing, ridiculing, attempted copying, they finally realized this thing changes everything, and they're all over it now. I mean, they're fucking all over
yeah,
it. So much big,
yeah.
proper money has moved into Bitcoin in the last year. But I don't know what that means, whether that's the end of it in some way. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch. But I feel like...
I sort of feel...
Go on.
I feel that it's almost like a kind of... It's not really where the game is. It's like it's this sort of financial manifestation of something that's actually much more essential and bigger. So I think there's a sort of like a focus on this quite a quirky kind of invention, like not invention, quite a quirky kind of almost kind of experiment, which is this limited amount of currency, right? Out there, and obviously, with a limited amount, limited supply, it becomes, tremendously valuable, and this and that, and but what I find is more fascinating, and I almost kind of like that the focus is somehow on that,
Yeah, that's
the thing,
right?
that the thing that it's ushered, which is this decentralization,
exactly,
is really taking.
Yeah.
Well, it's not actually manifesting itself very much yet, but my understanding is that this Web 3.0, where Tim Berners-Lee is involved again in, is going to be very different from the internet we've got now, because basically most of these proprietary functions that now are creating these new monopolies are going to be built into the system, right? The semantic web, is going to actually understand us a lot better, but it's not going to be owned by anyone. So the AI that's built into the web, it will be built for everyone, right? So a little bit, do you know what I mean? So Google algorithm is going to become non-proprietary, or something similar to it, you know what I mean? And all these other things like the eHarmony algorithm, and all these, because very few people actually use AI, and this is something that was really quite a sort of disappointing awakening to me, because I had this meeting with people from Indeed, which is the biggest recruiting, most successful recruiting platform in the world. And I mean, there's no real AI. It's very basic AI what they're doing, and there's hardly any learning, machine learning going on there. Basically, their best account have about 30 consultants on it, who are actually manually
Right.
themselves
Yeah, yeah,
figuring
yeah,
out the word matches, word matches, so
hmm
that the searches will be successful, right? So honestly, and it was quite a disappointment to me, because I thought, like, this must be cutting edge, right? But it's really not. It's really Google really has that kind of thing. They somehow, some people say that they have internet just completely mapped out. Basically, they have it actually on their servers, all of it, all the time, several times, right? So somebody says that's how it works, really, but I have no idea. But what's really interesting to me is that this not even idea, but the actual means of decentralization
Mm.
is what seems to be the new kind of liberating factor, in this coming era of Web 3.0. And I could be misinterpreting it, but this is kind of what I'm
I
understanding,
think
and that's very exciting to me.
yeah, you've got into something really exciting there, because and it is the thing about Bitcoin that nobody in general speaks about, but that's actually the most interesting thing, is the blockchain technology, and which is this kind of totally trustworthy third party which has never existed before, and the implications for law, for politics, are immense, and then, as you're saying, this kind of the decentralization. So there is no control, there is no monopoly, there is no central hierarchical control. That is a completely different way of being, and that will inevitably move into different areas of life. So if you start thinking about what that might do to disrupt politics, and even things like the notion of state and country, because I mean, to me it seems like these are the things that need to come apart now, is this idea of states and countries, because a lot of the friction and the problems come out of those concepts, which are industrial, and previously they had some meaning, but now, really, it's less and less important. And you've got the kind of physical, you do have the physical kind of um, restrictions and kind of things that bind people together, the cultural, physical locations of people. They will inevitably be important, but maybe there'll be this kind of regeneration of real localization. And, I'd like to see a kind of localized, wisdom led kind of politics on a small scale that's integrated globally through this technology to kind of coordinate, massive things, but very much a strong localized, local resources, local power, controlled by the people themselves in those areas.
Yeah,
All the richness you'll get from that culturally again, where kind of the differences in places in the world start to blossom again, instead of this homogenization that we've seen through the industrialized age. And so it's super exciting. I mean, I really hope that there is a way to kind of navigate towards this kind of vision for the web, because it's
I
so
mean,
needed now in all areas. It's the answer to the kind of the death of media and political corruptness and corporate kind of suicidal growth.
yeah,
So it's probably, I feel like it's the place where I'm certainly being called to now. And so, this kind of conversational form relates to that. This is a part of that for me, is people actually meeting, discussing, and a kind of the freedom of exchange of ideas without kind of the gatekeepers or the restrictions of authorized broadcast channels, or and this kind of calling now that the place where the future is being, or the future of any kind of freedom is being fought out and built, is on the internet.
yeah,
And we need a free and intelligent internet for that to happen. And I'm feeling particularly drawn to finding a way that I can help in that cause, you know. And I know you guys are already doing your version of that.
Well, it's very
with
interesting. I
Coconut.
mean, I think, yeah. I mean, I wasn't quite aware of that when we started, but now I'm really excited about it. Uh, well, you know, partly because of this, you know, and I just kind of stumbled upon this sort of information, if you like. But what's makes me feel? I mean, I'm excited, but I'm not worried. I'm just you know, kind of, what would you call it, uncomfortable somewhat, you know, because of the unknown, right? You know, because however destructive these modes of codependence and interdependence are familiar, right? You know, like you say, you know, you get used to
Yeah.
bad conditions, right? You get used to sort of, you know, destruction almost, you know.
Yeah, the devil you know, as they say.
Right. So you know, you sort of think about, you know, so it's like, so decentralization sounds like disassociation, right?
Hmm.
But then you have to kind of look further and go like, it actually means freedom of association
Hmm.
that's complete, right? And then you go like, but can we handle that, right? You know, like, you know, and what would it really mean? And the fact is, you have no idea what it would mean, absolutely no idea. And the tendency is to get fatalistic, and the positive choice is actually to be nihilistic, right? Because, you know, nihilist sort of is ready to rebuild, right? Or is ready to whatever comes next, right? Whereas the fatalist is a person who is just worried that the world's going to end, right? I choose the latter, the two, as a matter of self-discipline, because I almost cannot control my sense of unease that follows the immediate excitement, right? Like I feel actually, I feel uncanny, like it's an uncanny feeling, like my brain produces very, very quick kind of, not even visualization. It's really funny because I'm a visual, right? I'm a visual professional, right? But it's not, it's an emotional state that it produces, this associative, and I'm so seeking comfort in that imagined freedom, right? Where you're kind of like,
Well, you've got a lot to lose, right? Because you have a lot in this system, or in whatever shape it's in. You know, you have a lot of kind of security and material comfort and all the things you need. It's working for you. So that's a huge thing to kind of give up. And especially, you know, in your personal background as well, your experiences, I know because I know you early on when you came to London, you've got all of that memory of those uncomfortable places within you, and you don't want to go back there. I know, you know,
yeah,
it's a lot easier to be in those uncomfortable places when you're 20 than it is when you're 50, right? So
probably,
there's all,
probably.
and you've got children and responsibilities and all of that, you know. So I totally get it. I mean, I really do. Um, I suppose the only advantage to my slightly more precarious existence is that I'm so used to that now that, you know, it's like, well, fuck, how much worse could it be, you know? And it could be a lot worse, of course it could. I mean, you only have to look around the world and see, you know, 1,000 different versions of hell that are possible with humans. But I mean, you know, but there is this tremendous promise in that as well. But it will take, and this is what's always been sort of the worry, is that it takes a different kind of human to live in that space and to negotiate it in a good way. And
Absolutely.
that requires a certain level of development, it requires a certain perspective. And if you, and this is a big if in terms of the information we're getting, but if you look around and believe what you're being fed through social media, we're so polarized right now. However, I say that, but I don't know how real that is, because the more I'm understanding how social media works I'm realizing we're also being sold this story of how fucking separate we are, and it is having an impact on the world in a very real way. But I
Yeah.
wonder just how real it actually is. And it's more like a feedback loop of misinformation and triggering that is profitable, that's kind of creating reality, which is
Yeah.
horrifying in itself. Because I really believe that Facebook, Twitter, and to some extent YouTube have totally broken the world. I mean, in terms of it functioning, but maybe that's great because it had to break because it was fucking killing us. But it
Yes.
very much happened, and you've seen that in the last. I think with the virus is a great example, and the hysteria over the actual facts of what's going on, and in politics in the West, in America for sure, you can see, but even in Britain. Um, it's totally been broken now, our kind of way of understanding, and there's no longer a sense of we're all in the same place working it out. It's fractured, and I think this virus has almost fractured society into its individual constituent parts, which is each person. Even families, have been community that was already pretty much dead in Britain and the West because of the change from industrialization and all the kind of movements to dismantle community that were kind of either intentional or incidental. That what the process that kind of was that process that was finishing off community has been totally completed now in this separation of individuals in their houses away from family members because they can't see them. So in a way we've kind of dissolved society into its individual cells, which is terrifying. And yet now we've got all the individual parts, we can recombine them in any way we want. So it has a kind of potential in it as well. And I
Yeah.
feel like what you're kind of alluding to in this new way of organizing the web is going to unleash all kinds of possibilities for reorganizing institutions or recreating institutions or rethinking law, government, commerce, all of it, human interaction, relationship, all of those things. There's a potential now to, and I think that's kind of what we need. If we're going to survive, we have to reinvent everything because we've outgrown our way of life to the point of it almost killing us and, most of the other higher species, if you want to call them that, on Earth. So super exciting, I think. But so kind of chaotic and dangerous as well, and all the madness that's going on, all the kind of fantasy kind of worlds that are being created in people's minds that they're kind of enacting on the real world, and all the new religions that are sprouting up, and it's insane. It's an insane time. But fucking crazy. But then also, I mean, you have children. I also feel that because the kids inevitably being human and adaptive and being born into this time, they're born ready. And, I feel that with my own kids, like they're just going to take it on and they're going to do whatever they can. And I get a
Yeah.
lot of, on the dark days when I think we're totally fucked and God, do I even want to live in a world that's the world that's shaping up now the way it is? When I haven't remembered nature or the things that are eternal that do raise my spirits, I look at my kids and I think, yeah, but they're ready, and I've met so many amazing children because we did, as we did a parent and child group for 10 years here. So we sort of managed a few generations of kids in a way come through. And some of the beings that I've met have blown my mind. These little people who are like born wise, and the Yodas that have come through have really given me a lot of faith in a future. Because that is heartening for sure.
I mean,
Maybe kids are always like that. They just have that
maybe
effect.
being infantile is bred in, it's actually being taught, and our generation, previous ones, of the modern kind of era, maybe institutionally we've been infantilized, and then now that are sort of like these infantile adults are bringing these children into the world, letting them be free from being kind of told their place, given, pushed into their place. They're suddenly kind of expressed what in what reminds us as being grown up or somehow wise, beyond their age. But that's just our impression. They're just being freer to be who they are.
Exactly. So the kind of circle completes, because the adults are all infants. The children being born have this potential to become elders from the beginning, and it feels like that. And that's such a good point. It's that freedom, because we have dissolved all of that structure of, you need, you think about the Victorians and how fucking uptight and controlling, and children, that was where the sort of seen and not heard thing came from, and you wouldn't dare speak. Whereas now it's like you're totally liberated in a way, and you're pampered in that way. So that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, because to me, being infantilized can happen, almost at any point in our kind of world, because you could be excelling at what you do, right? And kind of get a new job, a better paid in a new company, and work under a boss that infantilizes you, right? Through just the way they behave, right? And the same, where I was struck the most by this sort of game of domination and that kind of gets institutionalized is, and this is something that has had a horrible kind of, just a kind of huge impact on me, and probably one of the big reasons why we actually moved back from the US is living in South Carolina, the social economic split is very much along the racial lines. Obviously there's this white poverty as well, but not so clearly, delineated. And then you have these, Black people who kind of like, in South Carolina, they a lot of them, especially older ones, middle-aged and older ones, they're sort of like in that sort of position, like they're on something that's kind of like an urban plantation. They're so underprivileged in terms of the kind of in a libertarian state like South Carolina that that anything that supports their growth, as a community and as individuals through free education, is completely suppressed by the libertarian low tax kind of, this sort of conviction that, if you put your back into it, you can sort of transcend, right? But then you speak to some of these older Black people, and they speak to a white person, and they try to sound like a child. It's been so drummed into them. It's been so they were completely raised with that kind of need to protect themselves by kind of pandering, in the most kind of banal way, and for me, who's not coming from any kind of colonial background, coming from Central Eastern Europe, socialist, whatever, also being kind of being raised in a kind of dose of, the sort of unaligned world, the Africa and Asia and the post-colonial, the Tito's Yugoslavia was very much kind of imbued with those kind of ideologies. You sort of, then you go to a place like South Carolina and you speak to your gardener who is like 80 years old, right? And he speaks to me like he's a child, right? He's twice my age, you know, and then you interview somebody for another kind of job, like a cleaner or something like that, and she also, you know, kind of like, you know, and that really broke my heart. It was like, you know, it was like, you know, so this phenomenon of being infantile is very much an institutional, in my opinion, very, very much an institutional phenomenon, you know, because, you know, if you're working under a domineering boss, you know, no matter how, I mean, you have to be of a very strong mind, you know, to resist, to be infantilized or manipulated to the point of kind of like a very, very damaging level of insecurity, you know.
You see, this is interesting because it makes me think that social media is perhaps doing the same thing, because I think about the kind of the tantrum-like childish way that left and right have been engaging, you know, in the sort of news feed that we're given. And the extremes, obviously, are the ones that rise up and are seen more. But that really is that same thing you're talking about. And that's kind of what struck me always whenever I saw something from left or right, that I just thought, God, this is like children in the schoolyard. You know, it's like there's no intelligent adult conversation here. It's just name calling or throwing up all over each other. You know, it is. And I wonder if that isn't a product of this weird kind of way of interacting that is totally new to us, you know, because we don't know what it is. We haven't been doing this before.
I have a feeling it has something in common with road rage. The you know, perfectly civilized people would kind of sit behind
it's the
steering wheel of a car.
It's the separation, because you're not in face to face, because you would never talk to somebody like that face to face.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen, or very rarely, or you know, in a very extreme situation. But there's a kind of, it's allowing that somehow, and in exactly that way you're saying, like in road rage, you know, where people are like going crazy.
I know that it's like, like the nicest person in the world suddenly becomes this kind of sort of swear word spewing monster, you know, like
it's a combination of total frustration
and total power
with no consequence. You know, your outburst has no social consequence or little social consequence, like it might have if somebody was face to face. And of course, reality bites when you get those moments where somebody stops and gets out of the car, you know, and opens the door, and then it changes very quickly, you know. But,
the funny thing is that actually, because the system is actually really very highly civilized, right? Traffic is an extremely successful kind of overall, you know, a sort of proof of what we like to call civilization, right? You know, we actually it really functions, you know, like in a huge percentage of time, you know. And so the same with sort of artificial systems like the internet. There's that opportunity to actually be extremely civilized, yet we choose seemingly to be completely the opposite, right? You know, it's just like, you know, it's just crazy. And that could be some kind of, you're right, some kind of like that kind of tantrum sort of tendency, you know, like, you know, that comes, kind of wells from within somehow, well, in a strange kind of way. It's like,
yeah, and it's combined, because it's combined with a sense of powerlessness in terms of what's going on in the world, or seemingly, because the power's been removed. Even you can't even vote for something now because it has no impact on what's actually going on. So maybe that, which is kind of treating you like an infant too, you've got no say in anything, and all you can do is kind of have a tantrum because the adults are not listening to you.
Yeah.
So you know, it's kind of, and then now you've got the mechanism to do it. And, you know, as soon as you put anonymity on that as well, like with Twitter or something, where you don't even have to be yourself, then that scales it up by, you know, 10 times or something. and people really become horrendous to each other because there's no consequence, you know.
I wonder if it's almost maybe if it's possibly the opposite, you know. Whether it's you know, like, you know how the kids that are allowed to take control, they become terrified and kind of monstrous. You know, they become really kind of unpleasant to be around. You know, the kids that are kind of never told no, or they manage to emotionally manipulate their surrounding adults around, and suddenly they kind of find themselves, crap, I'm in charge, you know?
Yeah.
And that kind of like, you know, so I don't really know whether, you know, being in charge of a car or kind of like, you know, like suddenly so triggers that sort of thing that you're actually manifesting this, you know, almost like a kind of like some kind of rupture, you know, like some kind of decoupling of sort of, you know, your place in the world, you know, you're sort of, the allocation of power has suddenly been sort of shifted, and you're sort of, so the same with the internet, you're broadcasting, right?
Yeah.
Right. So suddenly you have this power to kind of be seen and heard, and there's this kind of like a, you know, like a breaking down of a sense of orientation, right? You know, like of your scale in a way, you know, maybe. I don't really know. It's just
Yeah,
a
no,
kind of
that's
funny
interesting.
thing. But,
That
you
is
know,
interesting. Like the ego, it's like the prima donna comes out because now you're center stage in your own play or your own production, and you
yeah,
have
that
the
kind of
audience.
like a Jungian monster kind of starts to sort of dance around, you know, in the light rather
Yeah.
than the shadow.
Well,
You know,
you know,
but hey,
in the car situation, you're in this thing which you could kill yourself really quickly and easily, and you could kill other people. That's a hell of a responsibility, isn't it? It's like death is right
especially
there.
today's cars, you know, like, you know, today's cars, you know, like they really are. I mean, they are as controllable as they are sort of so quickly out of control. You know, like, you know, if you think about, you know, like how much power there is just right there. You know, it's just like it's quite something. Yeah, I don't know. Oh,
There we are.
well,
Maybe we're at the end. We've done pretty well there. We've done a couple of hours, I think.
spiraling. We didn't go in circles. It was a kind of spiral, which is nice. I
Spirals.
prefer spirals to circles.
Great. Well,
Good stuff.
yeah, I'm sure this will be the first of many because there's an endless kind of journey to go on here. But thanks for
Well, we
coming on.
seem to always kind of end in this kind of end in this endless, end in
Ending in
endlessness.
the endless. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Right. Well, I'll stop it now and then just hang on a moment and we can say goodbye. Well, thanks and take care.